Almost there. Okay, I believe we are official. Welcome, Cosmic Campers. I'm really happy to be joining y'all live now with the Reverend Dr. Matthew Fox.
Hello. Good to see you all, or be with you all. Can't see you yet.
Yes, unfortunately, we can't see them, but I believe they can see us.
Oh, I see. One way street. Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit one way. I'm assuming that many of you are already familiar with Dr. Fox and his work, but in case you aren't, for several decades now, he has been at the forefront of pioneering the intersection between contemplative spirituality, theology, activism, and creativity in a synthesis that he calls creation spirituality. He's a Dominican by training, but his work in bridging the gaps between different faith traditions and activism got him defrocked from that particular stream a while back, but he has found a grateful home in the Episcopal Church as well as in the broader Christian and inner spiritual communities. Is there anything I'm leaving out that you think would be salient for them to know here? As an orientation.
Pretty good, succinct storytelling there. Thank you, Trip.
Okay, sure. For me, when I was, in my own deconstruction journey, starting close to 20 years ago, and was a part of this wave that at the time was called the emerging church conversation. Your work, particularly Original Blessing, creation spirituality, and the coming of the cosmic Christ were passed around as examples of this whole other stream of theology and spirituality and practice that frankly I was clueless about as a kid growing up in the Bible Belt in the South. These streams that seemed at first, frankly, kind of dangerous, kind of heretical. And then I was like, well, maybe it's dangerous and heretical, but he sure seems to be drawing on, I don't know, Thomas Aquinas, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, and others that, were part of the pre-Protestant world for me. But, I gradually, once I overcame my fears, really got to sink my teeth into what you were sharing. If this is somebody's first encounter with you and your work, how would you describe creation spirituality?
Well, one word you just used was pre-Protestant, but I would go a little bigger and say pre-modern. That a pre-modern consciousness, because remember, Protestants grew up with the invention of the printing press, which of course was a great invention. And it changed, it turned religion inside out, the fact that everyone could have access to the Bible and to musical texts and all the rest. That was its positive side, but it carries a shadow too, and that is that it's about text. So text-oriented, the modern era, and Protestantism along with it. But context is a bigger story. And I think that your pre-modern thinkers, whether indigenous people or the people you've just named, like Meister Eckhart, Hildegard, Thomas Aquinas, Francis of Assisi, Julian of Norwich, they're living like indigenous people do in the cosmos, not just in the human psyche. You see, the modern era is very anthropocentric. Pope Francis hits it on the head when he talks about narcissism of our species of the past few centuries. That when you cut yourself off from the rest of creation and just look at your own man-made books and think that's what the Word of God is, you're leaving out a lot. Thomas Aquinas said, Revelation comes in 2 volumes, of the Bible and nature. All indigenous people know about nature being revelation of God, but for modern people, that's a big step. That really is. And so creation spirituality begins with creation. That would be, well, let's say the fireball 13.8 billion years ago. And that's a lot of unfolding of divine history and mystery and caring and compassion that preceded our species by about 13.8 billion years. So why would we want to leave that out of the telling of the story of the Word of God by anthropocentrizing this word, when in fact the Logos is in fact about the cosmic Christ, the Christ in all things, beginning with the fireball itself. So creation spirituality then begins not with the human problems, including original sin, which is a human thing, but with the unfolding of the universe itself. And it's the tradition of the wisdom literature of Israel. The wisdom tradition is nature-centered mysticism. Jesus, all scholars today agree, Jesus comes from that tradition. And many say that, he was excluded from the synagogue on the Sabbath because he was considered illegitimate. So others went to the synagogue, he went into nature on the Sabbath to pray, and it shows in all of his parables. He's such a keen observer of nature's ways and of God's ways through nature. And of course, as a young man, he apprenticed with John the Baptist in the desert, the wilderness. And in his day, in Jesus' day, in John the Baptist's day, there were lions living in that wilderness there. So that was quite a rite of passage for a young man to live alongside lions in the wilderness. That's the kind of background Jesus had. In addition to being a peasant farmer, he comes from Galilee, I like to say the Wisconsin of Israel. I happen to be from Wisconsin, but it's the green farming area of Israel. And it shows in all of his ways, really, in all of his stories. So the creation tradition also is, it's the first tradition in the Bible. The J source is creation-centered. And this gets lost. And it's feminist because wisdom and nature go together in the biblical tradition, Sophia and Hakma, and wisdom is feminine, but she's feminine around the world, not just in the biblical tradition. But we're told, like Book of Sirach, which I know Protestants don't have in their Bible, except at the end, it's apocryphal, but we Catholics had it. But it has marvelous imagery about how wisdom walks the vaults of the sky and walks on the sands of the ocean. So it just wonderfully embraces the cosmos. And that's part of Proverbs 8 too. And so wisdom is very important in the creation tradition, and the feminine is important. And of course, the prophetic. It's very connected to the prophets. Wisdom says that she is a friend of the prophets. And of course, Jesus was from the prophetic tradition as well as the wisdom tradition. And then these great medieval mystics that you named there, and that I've been exploring for years, they bring it all together. The way they bring justice together with contemplation and mysticism is really exciting for me. And I think it's energizing for all of us who hear about it.
Yeah, so you just painted us a picture of this tapestry starting from, the Hebrew creation stories through the prophets, through Jesus himself, where they have a lot more intimacy with nature, and creation informs a lot more of their spirituality, even though they didn't know some of the things we know now about the grandeur of the age of the universe that we're adding to our understanding.
Exactly, but they were keen to learn from science. Hildegard of Bingen said, all science comes from God. And Thomas Aquinas, of course, spent his whole adult life bringing Aristotle, who was the best scientist they could find in the 13th century, into the heart of his Christian faith. And it was a very controversial thing to do. The fundamentalists back then, just like today, said, who needs science? We've got all the answers. Whereas Aquinas, by turning to Aristotle, first of all, Aristotle was a pagan. That's one strike. Secondly, he was being translated by the Muslims in Bangkok, actually, and that's how he got into Europe. That's two strikes. And but Aquinas said, truth is truth. Whether it comes from pagans or Christians, it's truth. And he said, a mistake about creation results in a mistake about God. So if it's science's job to explore creation, which it is, then clearly science are assisting us in the revelation of the divine that we find in nature. And a good example of that in today's battles would be the subject of homosexuality. Science has spoken, just like Galileo spoke 400 years ago, and it took the Catholic Church 400 years to say he was right and they were wrong. So the same thing I think is true today in the argument, which I think is really silly and a waste of time, about homosexuality. That science has spoken about 8% of any given human population is going to be gay or lesbian. 464 other species have been counted with gay and lesbian populations. So get over it. It's a minority, it's a sexual minority, but it's there, and nature and God want this diversity, and it's good for everybody. So move on. So the whole thing about science having an important role to play in our understanding of the divine is a very primal concept in Aquinas and in the pre-modern students of nature and of revelation.
I feel like the picture you're painting for us is both a spirituality and a science that is open to experience, that's open to experimentation, that's open to fresh data. And it's encouraging that you're naming these historical figures who are very much a part of the Christian lineage, who were open to new data, new experiences, and were open to revising their understandings of reality. But even in Aquinas' day, you're naming there was opposition. Why does it feel like that today people who are open to fresh experiences in both spirituality and science are kind of a minority report within Christianity and religion generally?
Well, as Father B. Griffiths points out, all religion begins with experience. As he says, Buddha under the bo tree had his breakthrough experience. Muhammad with the dictating of the Quran had his experience. Jesus, of course, had many of his experiences. So that's the difference between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is about the experiential side of religion. And we experience God. We experience God. Bill Everson, the California poet who was a Dominican for 16 years, he says that the ordinary person experiences God in nature or experiences God not at all. And the God-thirsty person experiences God everywhere, because this quest for the word of God is a quest deep within all of us. And so we see it in all the news and in all the suffering and in all the efforts at justice and healing. So this is all part of panentheism, really, that the presence of the divine is found both in the light in all things, the cosmic Christ that way, and the wounds in all things, the wounds of the cosmic Christ, and our own wounds. We are all other Christs. So why do many people resist this, is your question. Well, for one thing, the institution invariably runs up against the mystics, and people who believe in institutions more than they do in the divine experience invest their energy that way, and they want to save the institution at all costs. An example of that currently is, of course, the horrible priestly pedophilia crisis in the Catholic Church today, and its cover-up by the hierarchy. Now, what they would be saying if you ask them is, well, we want to protect the institution, you see. Well, that demonstrates your very question, that some people have put all their eggs in the ecclesial institutional bucket instead of in the experiential give and take with divinity and its revelations in so many ways, including, of course, basic morality of protecting the young. And who was more fierce about that than Jesus, when he said, put a millstone around someone's neck and throw them in the water if they're abusing the young. So it's amazing what denial we can develop as human beings, like the denial of climate change today. It's amazing how people can distance themselves by choice between the truth and the worlds the bubbles we want to live in. It's scary, really. I don't think any other species has that capacity to distance themselves from reality like we can do. And we have to always be on alert for that within ourselves and within others who claim to represent us.
I wonder if distancing ourselves from the truth and distancing ourselves from nature are intimately connected.
Mm,
As you quoted earlier, the poet who said, the ordinary person will experience God in nature or not at all. I think of so many of us who are nature deprived, that because of the advent of civilization, the advent of our technological culture, we are hardly ever in nature. Like some people can live our entire lives outside of nature, whether it's because we're incredibly privileged and we just live in these techno bubbles, or if we're incredibly underprivileged and happen to live, in the middle of a city, in a food desert, in a concrete jungle, and we try to adapt, we try to make do. We've created apps to help us with meditation and prayer.
mm,
You and I are having this conversation right now because of technology. So there are these gifts, and yet at the same time it feels like we insulate ourselves. I recently did a permaculture certification immersion at a
mm.
local eco village and
Uh-huh.
spent 10 days, largely without cell phone signal, without electricity, without Wi-Fi. And it was so interesting, just how much more vulnerable we
Huh.
all were to the elements, how
Mm,
much I don't know, healthier and more alive that I
mm.
felt. There was this immediacy that it seems like we're missing.
Uh, that's a powerful story. Thanks for sharing it. Yes, what does it take to put our little gadgets aside and just be present in nature? And what is nature trying to say to us? If we're busy with our gadgets and we got our ears plugged and everything, we are cut off from nature, and we pay a price for that. Nature deficit disorder is an issue with a lot of children today. And like you say, people who are poor living in inner cities who cannot escape their world there. They don't have cars, they don't have the money to get out of town, etc. There's a price to pay for that, because obviously human beings are nature. Our bodies are nature. We eat the sun when we eat food. And, so it's not as if it's us versus nature, but as you say, it's our awareness. And if our daily routine, it cuts us off from the rhythm and the beat of nature, and we're only creating our own rhythm and beats, there's a real danger in that. And again, it to me, it echoes that powerful word from Pope Francis about narcissism, that as a species, we can imagine that we're alone, that we're not interconnected, you see. And that's the basis of what Jesus and all the great teachers are teaching us, that compassion is about interconnectivity. It's about working out our interconnectivity, whether it be at the level of joy and wonder that we share, or at the level of grief and sorrow and of suffering, and how we can diminish the suffering by works of compassion and justice. So it really takes in the whole picture, really, what we're talking about. And again, we have to be grateful. I mean, Thomas Aquinas says the essence of religion is gratitude. That's what it's really all about. He puts religion in the category of a virtue of thanks and gratitude. And that how grateful are we for the earth? How grateful are we for all those movements in the last 13 billion years that made the earth possible? If we just cut that out of our mind and out of our awareness, then we're living in a bubble. And but the truth is that every glass of water we drink, every ray of sunshine that falls on soil that gives us our food and so forth, this is where our gratitude begins. It's gratitude for the history of creation, the history of nature. And this is the primary starting point for a sense of the sacred. Buck Gostor, a coach and teacher, used to say to me, "You want to know how sacred water is? Go without it for 3 days." And he's right. Try that. It's a simple, cheap practice. It's not easy, but it's cheap. Go without water for 3 days. On that first sip, you are utterly grateful. Your whole body's grateful for that water that otherwise you could take for granted. And I think for me, that's one of the working definitions of mysticism. The mystic does not take for granted. We don't take our breath for granted. That's why many practices are about listening to your breath, paying attention to your breath. A friend of mine, a relative of mine, just died recently, and her last breath, is a sacred thing. Well, your first breath is a sacred thing. Everything between the first and the last breath is a sacred breath. But do we take that for granted far too easily? And now I'm living in Northern California. We've had this horrible air for 3 days because of the fires, which of course are caused by climate change. And, you can barely go outside and breathe. You have to wear a mask and the rest. We can't take healthy air for granted anymore in our circumstance today because we've been ignoring the sacredness of nature.
Yeah. So gratitude for what is. We often don't realize what we have until we don't have it, whether it's water or air. And this makes me think of, segueing a little bit to some of the topic of our conversation today around panentheism. Part of panentheism is gratitude for the God who is within and around us. And I know that for me, this was not an image of God, was not an experience of God that originally came to me. Growing up in the Bible Belt, we emphasize the idea of a radical separation of God due to the sinfulness of humanity, and that, Jesus coming was to try to bridge this ontological gap between God and us. So there's that style of separation. And as I got older and, began reading, some of the deists who were part of the founding fathers, they had a different idea of a separate God. It was a God who was this sort of mechanistic watchmaker who wound up the planet and the universe and the cosmos and just sort of stepped away from it. And as some of my friends deconstruct their faith and they, come out the other side, they've kind of come on the other side. Perhaps they spend a season as being outright atheists or materialists, but then they say, there's enough wonder in the universe that I'm willing to recognize the planet itself, the universe itself is sacred. I might even be willing to name the universe itself as God. But panentheism seems to be kind of a middle way, at least my understanding, and I'm curious as to your understanding. Is panentheism that recognition that at least the visible, sensible reality is sacred, can be considered God, but as per Aquinas or Eckhart or Bingen or Hildegard or Thomas Merton, who you've also done work, that there's still this touch of transcendence, this touch of agency. As you were writing your own story of coming to recognize panentheism in how I found God in everyone and everywhere, where would you locate yourself along that spectrum?
I see there that it's easy for Westerners, I think, to overly person. And of course, we have these images. For example, the Sistine Chapel of God as a guy with a long white, an old guy with a long white beard, old white guy with a long white beard. And I think the shadow side of fundamentalism images God as a punitive father, a father who's kind of full of revenge and judgment and so forth. And Meister says all the images we get for God come from an understanding of ourselves. So that's where it really gets tricky, that we have to be emptying our own soul at times, our own minds and imaginations, and let the divine happen. And that's what meditation and contemplation are about. These are practices that allow us to just be in the presence of the divine. And you don't need an image. In fact, Eckhart says, it's very Buddhist, his teaching at times, when he says, you should love God as a not God, a not person, a not image, a not thing, separate from all two-ness. It's pure Buddhism, but he never saw a Buddhist or read a Buddhist in his life. He got to that same experience from his meditations as a Christian, as a Dominican, same
Mm-hmm.
tradition I was part of. So that's where it's very important to realize that what Aquinas says, God can be named by every being in the universe. Every being is God, and no being is God. Every being is a name for God, and no being is a name for God. So to live with both corresponds to our deepest experience. So at times God is experienced as deeply immanent and present, profoundly so. But at times God is experienced as profoundly absent. And transcendence for me really means the dimension on the mystery of God being greater than anything our minds can deal with. There's a teaching in Judaism, in Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, that God is nothing, nothing that we can imagine. And that is, of course, what the mystics are saying too. And Aquinas is saying too, and it says God is none of these beings. All of these beings name God, and none of them name God. Mm-hmm. So I think we just have to swim in that and see what it does for us. And what it does, it keeps you very alert and on your toes for the divine breakthroughs that do happen, that really do happen if you're hungry and if you know how to let go. Meister Eckhart has a great line. He says, I pray God to rid me of God. That's one of the most radical prayers I've ever heard. Yeah. But there's reality to that we want to be careful of making God over in our image instead of our learning, our listening. And that's what contemplation is. It's about listening and taking in, about being receptive to the divine, and let the divine speak to us. Mm. And it may speak in rocks, it may speak in trees, it may speak in people, it may speak in scriptures, it may speak in the mystics, it may speak in liturgy and ritual, it may speak in the news of the day. I think that we want to be open to the word that is alive and wants to co-create with us.
Mm. What I hear you saying is that there can be an idolatry present when we become overly invested in our image and experience of God as the only possible image and experience of God, that it's a kind of graven ideology that is probably what Meister Eckhart has in mind of God, please rid me of this, rid me of this idea, this conception that is holding me back from experiencing the grandeur of you in the immediacy of now.
Yes, very well said. And Thomas Merton has this amazing line where he says that the marriage of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, and political fascism will give birth to the greatest orgy of idolatry the world has ever seen. He wrote about that in the 60s. He was, it's now proven, he died a martyr. He was murdered by our government on December 10th, 1968. So this is the 50th anniversary of his martyrdom.
Wow.
This, of course, is the same year that his friend Dr. King was murdered also, and Robert Kennedy was murdered 50 years ago. But my point is, that phrase, the greatest orgy of idolatry the world has ever seen, when you have cultural appropriation of divinity, along with a perverse version of religious idolatry, that we're really in deep trouble in those circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah, an orgy of idolatry. That certainly seems appropriate to the news feeds that I see these days. Just last week, or maybe it was the week before, there were these photos that appeared of these billboards that were taken out around the United States of this image of Donald Trump speaking, and underneath it said, "And the Word became flesh."
Whoa. Whoa. That wasn't satire? That wasn't satire?
I don't know. People seem to be taking it pretty seriously on all sides. To the credit of some conservatives I knew, they were like, "This too far. I can't help but think that there was some trolling going on. Like
Uh-huh.
I can't
Uh-huh.
imagine people would put that up with a straight face. But
Yeah.
what I have heard, from a number of evangelicals, 81% of white evangelicals voted Trump in the 2016 election, and I think that nearly 70+% continue to hold that line in the midterms of
Mm.
white evangelicals, from what I understand. And they tend to do these sort of backflips around justifying that, like, well, he is a King Cyrus, sure, he doesn't have a lick of faith himself, but God's going to use him as this sort of blunt force instrument to get our agenda advanced. And their agenda, of course, has been reduced to restricting marriage equality and abortion. And
Oh.
so it's so interesting to think of my upbringing, where we were taught that we were the moral majority and that character counted in our public leaders, and to hear the sort of backflips of rationalization that are happening now.
Uh-huh.
Um, it's so interesting, and it keeps me on my toes, because it'd be very easy for me to say, oh, those terrible people over there, look how idolatrous they're being. But it has me want to stay alert in terms of the ways that I might also be lapsing into, being an ideologue who can't see the forest for the trees.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that self-examination that you're willing to undergo, and that's the difference, I think, between being prophetic and being a zealot. That zealots don't admit that we all have to criticize ourselves as well as the other structures that we're part of here. Which reminds me, I have to turn my phone off here. I apologize.
No worries.
It doesn't seem to want to turn off here.
No worries. Just hustle and bustle everywhere. I'm coming here live from Haw Creek Commons in Asheville, and there's all sorts of activity happening in my background as well.
Oh,
All good.
Okay. Right, we're interrupting our day a little for this conversation.
Yeah, but that dance you described between what contemplative theology would call the apophatic and the cataphatic, the sort of the sensible realm of the imagination and what we name as the cataphatic, and then this sort of realm that exists beyond images, beyond ideas of the apophatic. I think that's an important dance for anyone to go on as you're maybe attempting to locate yourself on the sort of theistic, pantheistic spectrum.
Yes.
And I wasn't going to mention it today, but why not? It's so salient. You recently came out with a book called Naming the Unnameable, 89 Wonderful and Useful Names for God, including the unnameable God. Would you say something about this as it relates to what we've been talking about?
You read my mind, because we've gotten into that conversation here. Definitely, that book is really framed by Aquinas's teaching that every being is a name for God, and no being is. So if every being is a name for God, then God has trillions and trillions of names. And I think what I tried to do in that book, which is a short book, is in a sense to create a practice. And I really think it takes the top of your head off, because it invites everybody to come up with names for God. And I think this is a great way of kind of clearing our minds of idolatry and of taking for granted, and of really asking, what speaks to us today about the divine presence in the world. And so a number of the names that I have there come from science, such as the word flow or the word energy and so forth. And in fact, it's scientists who first responded to that book and got very excited about it. And I'm pleased about that, because in our culture, things don't move very far without science is kind of getting on board. And because I think it relates to what we said earlier, that science is exploring what is for us, and we should be listening. It doesn't mean they're right all the time, but I think they're eager to study and to learn. So I think practices like that book offers allows us to really refresh our theological consciousness and to start over. And I think that religion today needs to kind of start over. That doesn't mean we throw out the treasures of the past, but if we're going to start over with the mystical experience, the experience of unity and the divine within all of us, then we have to kind of clear the table for this to happen, and then we can reconnect what we find as valuable and useful to what previous generations found. And we'll find a lot of beautiful connections, and we'll find it in all the world traditions. I mean, even this practice, I acknowledge in the first page of my book that it was the Sufi practice of the 99 most beautiful names for God that got me going on this. And that's why I didn't want 99. I just wanted 89. I didn't want to compete or say, move over, Sufis. No, I just want to say, here's some 89. And let's get the conversation going. What are your names for God? And let's get the ball rolling.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you're watching this right now and you're curious to whet your appetite, I'm just going to read you 3 of the headlines of these 89 names. God is the true rest. God is a great bird. And God is the wilderness and destroyer. And in each of these, there's a short reflection where Matthew backs it up, where he draws on scripture, tradition, observation, experience, and shows us these fresh images that we may not have considered. And so I think if you're looking for, an Advent devotional, or if you're looking for something to start your new year off as you're re-exploring and re-engaging your faith, I would definitely recommend Naming the Unnameable as a fertile ground for exploration.
Oh, thank you. That was an unpaid.
Ding. Yep. It just came up. I've been reading it, and I want to talk a little bit about Order of the Sacred Earth as well during our time. But before we transition to that, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you want to say about panentheism. For those of you who have already received our email devotional excerpt from the book, or perhaps you've actually had the book and you've read the entire thing, Matthew talks about just his own story, how he prefers panentheism to conventional theism, and the different places that you find it within the Christian tradition and other places. So is there anything that you would like to speak to about that here?
Well, for me, panentheism names the mystical approach to religion, because it is about the experiential presence of the divine. And it's not about God up there and us here. It's about beings in God and God in beings. And I think this takes things down to earth. And there are tremendous political implications for this. I think it's democratic, it's horizontal, and it's circular. It's not about hierarchy as such. It's not putting God at the top of a ladder or up in the sky exclusively. And even the sky, is not up. The sky is in us. The sky is the air that we breathe. This is a scientific fact. And so we think, the sky's up there, it's blue or it's gray or whatnot. No, we're breathing the sky every day. And in fact, the sky is only 10 miles away. Once you leave 10 miles from the earth, there's no longer sky, there's no longer air, nothing to breathe. And so sky is very intimate. It's like God. It's inside of us and it's around us. And here in Northern California is now gray because of the forest fires, but often it's blue and brilliant. But again, to get over the notion that, or of whether the notion of theism, that God is out there or even that sky is out there. No, both are within and around and of course expand far beyond us. So I think that's important to realize the political implications of panentheism. And I think that's one reason it's been kept secret. See, the mystics challenge the empire. That's why Jesus got killed, it was because he challenged the empire. And he said the kingdom is here, and he wasn't talking about the empire's kingdom. He was talking about another kingdom. It was up, and that is the creation itself is blessed, that the kingdom and queen of God are within us and among us. And that was very disturbing to the powers that be at the time. And it's still disturbing if you're talking about the rainforest in the Amazon, for example, or any other area of the earth that is being destroyed, desecrated today by a multinational corporations, which are the new empire. And so, you know, John Dominic Crossan points out that the word in Christ is used 164 times in Paul's writings. 164 times. That guy was obsessed with this phrase.
Mm-hmm.
But in many ways, it was very political. It was in contradistinction to being in the empire. So it kind of invited Christians to choose. Are you going to be an empire guy, or are you going to be a Christ guy? And are you in the empire? Are you a full citizen and therefore paying the taxes that are part of the of these people, including the Jews? Or are you in Christ and looking for the movement of love and justice that the Bible promises? So I don't think we can underestimate this profound paradigm shift from theism to panentheism. And panentheism, as I say, is another way of talking about the mystical. We find God in all things. And if we haven't, we should take some time off and do it. And like the practice I offered, go without water for 3 days, and you'll know how sacred water is. And that applies to so much else.
Maybe only try that one with a doctor's supervision, but heck, even go without water for 6 hours, you'll certainly experience some kind of thirst.
Right, have a glass of water in the refrigerator just in case.
Well, you know, speaking of finding God in all things, in your chapter in the book, you describe an early nature experience you have at Niagara Falls. Would you mind sharing that for those who maybe haven't read it?
Well, I remember my family, which was 7 kids and 2 parents. We drove east one summer when I was about 11. And among other things, we visited relatives out there in Pennsylvania. But we also went to Niagara Falls. And I just remember just what an awesome experience it was. One of the first words you used in this dialogue was about wonder. And you know, Rabbi Heschel says that awe and wonder is the mind, the act of the mind confronting the universe. Beautiful definition. The act of the mind confronting the universe. Well, you know, if you've been to Niagara Falls, and especially if you're a kid, it's just awesome. That, you know, it's beyond words, the power of it and the excitement of the beauty and the rainbow over it and all the rest. You know, it just blew my mind. I had a mystical experience. I didn't know that word at the time, but I had a lot of those experiences when I was young. In high school, I remember reading War and Peace, Tolstoy. It was a mystical experience. I told my friend it blew my soul wide open, and I wanted to explore what happened to my soul. And that's why I joined the Dominicans, frankly, to explore what was that. It was a mystical experience. And so again, I think we underestimate how we're made. The human psyche is made for the cosmos. It's fashioned to marry the cosmos. And this is why great ritual, consider Stonehenge, for example. What was it that got our relatives there to drag these rocks that weighed thousands of tons, you know, before the wheel was invented, miles and miles? What got them out of their couches to do that? You know, it was ritual. They wanted to set this deal up so they could really celebrate the equinox and the solstice, the special relationship between the sky, Father Sky, and the seasons, and their own and the human experience. And all ritual is really about the microcosm meeting the macrocosm, and thereby turning on the human soul. Mm-hmm. And so the great hoop of the universe connects to the modest hoop of the human race and our communities. And that's when all this electricity happens, that's when we get turned on about life. And we get all the energy to live in community and to undergo the struggle and make it happen, you know? So I think we can really underestimate how when we separate psyche and cosmos, that's really the original sin. Without that, you just fall into narcissism and self-pity and everything else. But when you marry them again, that's where the energy comes. And that's what real ritual is about. And I think that's what recovering the sacred is about. Does that make any sense? Hello? Hello? You seem to have frozen. Can you hear me? I'm not hearing anything. Are you okay? I'm here. There.
Oh, here we go.
We lost you.
Yeah, I lost you too for a moment. I'm going to trust, I think actually that you were coming through on Facebook and it was simply me who couldn't see you. So I'm going to trust that that's the case. And were you in the middle of a thought when you lost me?
I don't know when you froze. I thought I ended my thought, but then I saw your picture, but you weren't talking.
I think you did. So we'll move on. I want to pick up on something that you said a moment ago about the importance of ritual and how we're wired for the cosmos. We're meant to take in the cosmos. It seems like what you're saying is, good ritual will help us facilitate a remembrance, a sort of recollection of our place in the scheme of things. And I think that bad religion or bad ritual tends to numb us, to sort of, through the routinization, make the sacred banal instead. Yeah. And so I want to talk a little bit about your practice of cosmic mass. When I first began to participate in the emerging church conversation, I took a really kind of global perspective and a sleuthing perspective. And I knew something that maybe a lot of US emerging folks didn't realize, which is that in many ways, the case could be made that the origins and the genesis of this movement came from this community out in England known as the 9 o'clock service that, met with a rather tragic end for various reasons. But before that, really brought together Anglican and Baptist and charismatic spirituality. And when they began to evolve, they discovered your work across the pond with creation spirituality. They reached out to you and y'all melded your incredible creativity in what was then called the techno cosmic mass. And you began to work on that. Would you like to share a little bit about, the origins of this work and what inspires you to keep it going today? Like, what is it?
We just did one a Sunday ago at the World Parliament in Toronto at 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and 500 people showed up, and it was powerful. It was wonderful. And people from many traditions, there were Buddhist monks there and others. And many people said afterwards, they said they didn't have words for what happened to them. One guy who was in his 60s, and it turned out was Mennonite, he said, this is the most powerful experience in my life. And I don't mean just religious experience. I mean the most powerful experience in my life. So it was extremely well received. And as a result, we're getting a lot of invitations now to do it elsewhere. People are ready for ritual that works. I loved your word about banal as opposed to banal ritual. And for one thing, we have this new cosmology today, and so we should be celebrating it. We should be putting it into our bodies, into our imaginations, into our ritual. And that's the shortcut for telling great stories. It always has been with our species. And a lot of ritual, as you say, has become banal. That is so text-oriented. It's about being on the right page or something, that it's not inviting us into the cosmic wonder and power and beauty and sacredness that is begging us to come aboard again. But story right, that it was this group in Sheffield, England, who were a rave group originally, and rave as a healing experience because it was during the crash of the industry in Sheffield. It's the Rust Belt of England. And so there were a lot of unemployed men, and a lot of their children had been kicked out of home, because when you have a lot of unemployment, you have a lot of alcoholism, and you have men who are very unhappy and they kick their kids out of the house. So these people joined on the streets to become a rave community, and they were getting along and doing their dancing and all this. And one of them, who was very bright, said, well, this feels like religion to me. Let's take it to the church. And they took it to this Anglican church and said, we'd like to come here regularly and do worship. Oh, great. Do your thing. 6 months after they did, the director came to them and said, now you have to leave. They said, why? He said, I'm getting too many complaints that there are too many young people in church. The last time that sentence has been uttered, I think, in Western culture was then. So then they found a public space in downtown Sheffield and started their services. And they were using the new, what I call the postmodern art forms, DJ and VJ and rap and so forth, and getting these amazing results. And like you say, I met them. They came out to see me and brought their newspaper clippings. And I said, how can I help you guys? Well, I had just written my book on the reinvention of work, and the last chapter was on reinventing ritual, where I talked about bringing the body back and also making space for contemplation and silence and all this. And they were doing all this in their ritual. So I was very turned on, and I flew to Sheffield to check it out and liked it. How could I help? I said, well, if you became an Episcopal priest, they said, you could run interference for us because you get what we're doing. So I thought about, well, the Pope had just fired me a few months earlier. And well, the Pope doesn't meet. So I went to the Episcopal bishop in California and said, I want to become Episcopal priest, but only for one reason, to work with young people to reinvent forms of worship. And Bishop Swing said, go for it. So that's kind of how it happened. Then there's a longer story involved. We brought them all over. I got a grant from Anita Roddick, brought 35 of them over with all their equipment. They did their planetary mass in the basement of Grace Cathedral. And Jerry Garcia was there, among others. And it made the front page of the Chronicle and all that. It was very well received. Then they went back, but then there was a scandal. The head priest, young guy, was fleecing some of his female flock. So the whole thing collapsed in Sheffield. Just as we were about to start it up in Oakland. So then we said, well, what now? And I said, well, we'll do it transparently. Unlike him, he had secrets going that we didn't know about. But we knew he had a very valuable movement going here. And so we made ours transparent. I hired a woman to run the thing who was not ordained, but had a good background in film and so forth. And anyway, we've never had a scandal in 25 years. We've done over 100 of these. And clearly it's time. I think the time has come because a ritual is so needed for, as we said, connecting psyche and cosmos, but also for healing and for bringing the joy alive. And this is what happened last week when we did it at the World Parliament. People got into it so deeply. They were really ready to pray. And we always do the grieving too. Grieving is such an important part of spiritual practice today. And I get people down on all fours, all sixes, and we grieve from the third chakra. The sounds come out. Very powerful, very important. We're all carrying grief today. I say there are two people in the world, two kinds of people. One who know they're in grief, and the others who are in grief but don't know it. We're all in grief about what we're losing and about what's happening all around us. And we've got to have practices that give that grief attention. Because once you can do the grieving, then you can move on to the creativity. But creativity is blocked if we've got a boulder of grief in our hearts that goes unattended. So I think that's a deep part of everything we do in the cosmic mass is the grieving, but we also do the dancing, the celebrating, I did it a few years ago for 1,000 people at a Sounds True conference in the Rocky Mountains. And afterwards, a woman came up, she said, I'm an atheist. I'm such a fierce atheist that if I walk down the street and there's a church, I cross the street to go by the church. But she said, she pointed to her heart. During that grieving part, she said, something happened. And she pointed over here, she said, something shifted. She said, by the time communion came along, I had to have some. She said, I was hungry for it. Yeah. She said, this day has changed my life. I don't know what's next, but I'm a different person now. Yeah. So transformation has to happen, and it has to happen fast. We have 12 years left as a species to turn the corner on this whole climate change thing. And, it's not about more scientific information and facts. That's not what's going to change us. Even politicians aren't going to change us. We have to change from the inside, and that's ritual's job. That's spirituality's job. And we got to get these things moving today. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that end, that's a great transition to the final thing I'd love to chat with you about today. You've been feeling this sense of urgency for decades. Something that I've observed about you is that in any given 5 year period of time, you seem to be mentoring someone of the next generation, whatever that generation happens to be. You seem to have, young people by your side that are collaborating with you on every level, whether creating these ritual experiences, whether writing books with you. And most recently, in addition to the anthology that we've been discussing, you've contributed to another anthology that I think folks in this group would probably be very interested in. It's called The Order of the Sacred Earth, subtitle An Intergenerational Vision of Love and Action. And you collaborated on this as one of the editors with another very dynamic couple who have come to be friends of mine, Jen and Sky. Would you tell us a little bit about both the book and the order in general, and what inspired you all to create this?
Well, for me, it came as a dream 2.5 years ago that woke me up at 4 a.m, and the dream said, "Do it," capital letters, 4 exclamation points. What was it that I was to do? Start a new order that isn't a religious order, but a spiritual order that draws people from all traditions and none. But that what binds us together is a vow. I promise to be the best lover of Earth and the best defender of Earth that I can be. That's the one vow. Huh. And with that, I think religion could change, because when I look at the scene today, religious scene, there's a lot of sadness about it. There's a lot is going downhill in many respects. People, especially young people, are stumbling over each other to leave church. And so I look around and say, what's happening? Well, if you look at history, when there were downturns in religion in the West before, new orders sprang up. So you had the church, the Desert Fathers and Mothers in the 3rd century. In the 5th century, you had the Benedictines and St. Benedict, St. Scholastica. So the monastic system really took off. In the 12th century, the monastic system went sour. It was too allied with the feudal system of the Middle Ages. And then you had Francis of Assisi and Dominic starting a new version of order. And in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, and I see the different denominations as really like lay orders, if you will. And you also had the Ignatius and the launching of the Jesuits. But all the Protestants and Ignatius responded to the corruption of the Vatican in the 16th century. Well, today you look around and there's a lot of downness in religion in the West, but I don't see a lot of newness happening. So, well, maybe we need a new kind of order that is not religious. It's not beholden to one religion, but it really recognizes what's happening in the world today. And that is that there is, especially the younger generation, there's an awareness that there's wisdom to be found in all these traditions, but they have to ally with science. And they have to be about action as well as contemplation. And the primary issue of our time is the health and integrity of Mother Earth, our common home, as Pope Francis put it. So why not give this a shot? And so that's what the order, as I see it, is about. Now, Skylar, who's 32 years old, had his own dream, which was special and in some ways parallel. And then Jen Lustig, his friend, who's those two other directors. I think young people have to lead this. I'm an elder. We need elders and young people working together today. But because it's your generation that's carrying the brunt of the forward thrust that we have to accomplish today. And we have to, I travel with, not with basilicas on our back, but with backpacks. We need light practices, deep but light, because we have to be ready to act as well as to contemplate. And so we put out this book. The first half is the three of us talking about our vision, and the last half are short essays by a number of other people, including Mirabai Starr and Brian Swim, the cosmologist, and David Corton and others who have their response to the vision too. And it's self-generating, self-organizing. It's not about a headquarters telling us what's right and wrong. It's about adults treating each other as adults, gathering in pods, what we call pods, in different bioregions, and talking about what this means in that region, how they're going to contribute to this vision. And it's really quite exciting. And when we did our first vow taking on the solstice last December, 80 people showed up. It was at a Buddhist center in Berkeley. Wow. And there was at least one atheist, and there were indigenous people and Jewish, Christian, Sufi, Buddhist center. The whole gamut was there. And the atheist, a 28-year-old woman, said to me, I'm atheist, but she said, I'm looking for a community that shares my values. You guys, it sounds like you guys do, so I'm here. Count me in. So we'll see what becomes of it, but I'm glad for your interest in it. And I think because orders work much faster than religions. Religions are like big ships. It takes them forever to turn just a little bit. But an order is focused, and an order gets off the ground fast. And I think that's why an order is very fitting today.
Yeah, absolutely. What's been happening lately? Are people taking the vow? I know you can go to orderofthesacredearth.org and you can check it out. You can take the vow yourself. I believe there might be resources on there for how to self-organize your own local gathering around the order. Yeah. Like what momentum has been happening?
Well, I know one group sprang up in Asheville. I get it mixed up. Ashland, Oregon. Yeah. And it sounds very strong. They've got a wonderful webpage and so forth. I'm sure you'd find a link on the Order of the Sacred Earth webpage. But there have been other groups. There's a group in Illinois, a group in Florida, two groups in Southern California. So things, and we have to raise some money maybe so we can communicate better with each other and have someone kind of full-time watching what's happening. But I sense a great deal of energy behind it. And we're planning to have another kind of public event this solstice, which will be mirrored, we hope, in places around the country and around the world. I know there's some international groups that are also getting on board for this. So I think we just have to watch it, but also encourage people. Do they feel that this might be an answer to their quest for some spiritual depth to carry them into the kind of action that is needed today to wake people up?
Yeah, that's really inspiring. I'm so glad that this initiative is happening, and we plan to have Jen and Sky here in the Cosmic Campfire group to also share a little bit from their own experience about the order, and hope to continue to find ways to engage on that. But well, thank you so much for your time here today, sharing a bit of your journey. I know it's been instructive for me, and I'll imagine it has been for a lot of others here. We'll definitely be doing this again soon.
Thank you, Chip. Thanks for the great questions that you ask. Glad you're working at this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. All right. I stopped the video and okay, let's see. Yeah, hold on. One moment here.